My in-laws mailed me an itemized invoice for everything they'd done for me over the past 11 years. Babysitting hours, holiday gifts, a contribution toward our wedding total, due $14,600, with a note suggesting it was time I started giving back to this family. The envelope arrived on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and a grocery flyer, as if it belonged in the same category as everything else in the stack. They had no idea that 4 months earlier, my company had quietly purchased a distressed debt portfolio that included their own defaulted accounts, $47,000 of it, and that the woman they were billing for babysitting was the only reason a collections agency hadn't already started calling their house every day. If you've ever been asked to pay a debt you never owed by people who had no idea what they actually owed themselves, stay with me, because this one still makes me shake my head a little. My name is Renee. I've been married to my husband, Eric, for 11 years, and for most of that time, his parents, Harold and Paulette, have treated my presence in the family like a favor I hadn't yet earned, no matter how much I actually contributed to it. I work in receivables management for a financial services firm that acquires distressed consumer debt portfolios, credit cards, medical bills, personal loans that have gone unpaid long enough that the original lender sells them off in bulk, at a steep discount to companies like mine, who then manage collection, or in some cases, restructuring. It's not glamorous work, mostly spreadsheets, account audits, and legal compliance reviews, but it means I spend my professional life looking at exactly the kind of financial trouble most families work very hard to keep hidden from each other. I've built a career out of reading between the lines of someone else's financial story, noticing the gap between what people say about their money and what their accounts actually show. Harold and Paulette had always presented themselves within the family, and to their wider social circle as comfortably established a paid-off house, a respectable pension from Harold's decades at a manufacturing plant, enough for Paulette to host elaborate holiday dinners every year without ever mentioning cost. They treated me from the day Eric introduced us as someone who'd married slightly above her station, despite the fact that I held a stable, well-paying job, and Eric worked as a high school teacher, a profession Paulette once described at a dinner within my first year of dating Eric as noble, but not exactly a plan. I remember laughing politely at the time, assuming it was an isolated comment rather than the opening note of a decade-long theme. Looking back, I can trace almost every subsequent interaction to that same unspoken assumption that I'd somehow gotten more out of this marriage than I'd brought into it, an assumption nobody in the family ever seemed to apply to their own finances with the same scrutiny. One detail I noticed over the years, and filed away the way professional habit trains you to notice financial inconsistencies. Harold and Paulette's lifestyle had quietly gradually contracted over the past 3 years. Fewer trips, a canceled country club membership, Paulette mentioning once that they'd simplified their holiday shopping. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone would necessarily connect to financial trouble rather than simply aging preferences. I noticed it anyway because noticing exactly that kind of quiet contraction is what I do for a living, though I never once connected it to anything more serious, since Harold and Paulette gave no other outward sign of struggle and continued spending on appearances, even as smaller private comforts quietly disappeared. The condescension had always been present in small, deniable ways, but it sharpened noticeably over the 18 months before the invoice arrived. At a family dinner about a year and a half earlier, Paulette mentioned apropos of nothing that she sometimes worried Eric had settled too early before he'd had the chance to see what else might have been out there for him. Eric laughed it off as his mother being dramatic. I sat with the comment longer than I let on, turning it over on the drive home, the specific phrase settled too early landing somewhere I couldn't quite explain to Eric without sounding like I was overreacting to a single sentence. 6 months later at Eric's birthday, Harold made a toast that included the line, "To my son who works with his hands and his heart, unlike some of the money chasers out there." He didn't look at me while he said it, but everyone at the table understood exactly who money chasers referred to, given that I was the only person present who worked in finance. Eric squeezed my hand under the table, an unspoken apology for something his father clearly wasn't going to offer directly himself, and I smiled through the rest of the toast the way I'd learned to smile through most of Harold's comments, by then filing the sting away, rather than letting it show at a party meant to celebrate someone I loved. Around the same time, Paulette started mentioning with increasing frequency all the things she and Harold had done for Eric growing up: piano lessons, a car for his 16th birthday, help with his student loans, always framed as context for how much they'd sacrificed and always delivered in a tone that implied some kind of debt. Eric, and by extension, I hadn't yet acknowledged properly. At one dinner, she added almost as an aside, "Of course we never expected anything back at the time. Things were different then." The phrase "at the time" struck me as an odd qualifier for something supposedly unconditional, the kind of small linguistic tell I'd learned to notice in far more formal settings than a family dinner table. A few months after that, at a family barbecue, Paulette cornered me near the dessert table and said with rehearsed warmth, "You know, Renee, I do think about how much easier things would be if family understood reciprocity better. Harold and I gave so freely for so long." I asked gently whether something specific was on her mind. She patted my arm and said, "Not at all, dear. Just reflecting in the particular tone she always used right before revealing that she'd been reflecting quite specifically indeed." I remember standing there afterward, paper plate in hand, watching her rejoin a cluster of her book club friends and laugh easily, wondering what exactly she thought reciprocity was supposed to look like from someone who'd already given 11 years of holidays, birthdays, and quiet patience to a family that rarely returned the warmth in kind. 3 months before the invoice at a Sunday dinner, Paulette said directly to me this time, "You know, Renee, family is about reciprocity. Harold and I have given so much to this family over the years. I do wonder sometimes what we'll get back in our later years from people who've benefited so much from us." I asked carefully what she meant specifically. She said, "Oh, nothing specific, just something to think about," in the tone of someone who meant something very specific indeed. Folding her napkin with unnecessary precision the way she always did when a conversation was about to end on her terms rather than mine. 6 weeks before the invoice, Eric mentioned that his parents had asked him somewhat urgently whether we could help out with a few things financially without specifying an amount or a reason. I offered to sit down with them directly to understand what they actually needed. Paulette declined, saying it wasn't quite time yet for that conversation, a phrase that struck me as strange enough to file away alongside everything else. The same instinct that made me pause on odd financial phrasing at work whenever a client's story didn't quite line up with their numbers. A week after that, Harold called Eric directly, something he rarely did, to ask whether Renee's company ever helps regular families, not just businesses. Eric relayed the question to me that evening, more confused than concerned, assuming his father was just curious about my work in a general way. I told him honestly that my company mostly handled bulk institutional accounts rather than individual walk-in requests, and thought little more of it at the time, filing the question away with everything else that didn't quite add up yet the way I always did, when a detail felt slightly off but not urgent enough to chase down immediately. If your in-laws had spent 18 months hinting at some unspoken debt you supposedly owed them, would you have pushed for a direct conversation sooner the way I wanted to, or waited to see what they were actually building toward? Tell me honestly in the comments, because looking back, I think part of me already sensed something larger was underneath all those small comments long before I had any actual proof of what it was. The invoice arrived on a Tuesday, a single typed sheet inside a greeting card envelope. No explanation beyond a note from Paulette, reading, "We thought it was time you understood the true value of what we've given, and time this family started giving back." The itemized list ran 12 lines, 340 hours of babysitting at a suggested market rate, a $2,000 wedding contribution, holiday gifts, totaling an estimated $6,400 across 11 years. Even a line item for emotional support during Eric's early career, struggles each converted into a dollar figure totaling $14,600, due the note specified at your earliest convenience given everything. I read it twice at the kitchen counter, coffee going cold beside me. Genuinely unsure at first whether it was some kind of joke I wasn't understanding. It wasn't. The formatting was careful columns aligned a small subtotal line before the final total, the kind of document someone spends real time constructing, rather than dashing off in a moment of anger. I noticed almost absurdly that Paulette had even included a line for sales tax equivalent, as if she'd genuinely modeled the invoice after something she'd seen a real business send. I sat with that invoice for a long time before showing Eric, partly out of disbelief, partly because I needed to decide how I wanted to handle something this deliberately calculatedly insulting. When I did show him, he went pale, then furious, immediately offering to call his parents and end the conversation entirely. "This is insane," he said, reading it a third time, as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something more reasonable. "They want money for babysitting? For loving me? For emotional support during my career struggles when they barely called me during any of that?" I asked him to wait. Not because I wasn't angry too, but because some professional instinct told me the invoice deserved a slower, more deliberate response than a phone call made in the heat of the moment. "I need a few days," I told him. Not to forgive it, just to figure out exactly how I want to respond. 2 weeks earlier, entirely unrelated, I'd been running a routine account audit on a new debt portfolio my firm had acquired from a regional bank, nearly 4,000 defaulted accounts purchased in bulk, the kind of acquisition my team processed several times a year, usually without a single name in the file, meaning anything personal to me at all. I hadn't reviewed the individual account names during the initial audit. That level of detail typically came later, account by account as we prepared restructuring or collection outreach. It wasn't until the invoice from Paulette arrived that some instinct made me go back and search the portfolio, directly entering Harold and Paulette's names, out of nothing more than professional curiosity about whether their recent lifestyle contraction had a documented cause. A hunch I almost didn't act on, assuming I'd find nothing, and feel slightly foolish for checking the kind of thing I might have mentioned to Eric as an amusing coincidence. That wasn't rather than what it actually turned out to be. Their names came back immediately. 2 defaulted credit accounts and a medical debt from a hospitalization 3 years earlier totaling just over $47,000 sold off by the original creditors after 18 months of missed payments purchased by my own firm 4 months prior as part of a routine bulk acquisition I'd had no personal role in selecting. I sat at my desk for a long time after finding it, the same 20-minute pause I'd learned to take with anything requiring careful handling rather than immediate reaction, staring at a name I'd heard condescend to me across 100 dinner tables, now reduced to 3 lines in a spreadsheet of defaulted debt. I remember closing my laptop halfway at one point, as if that alone might undo what I'd just read, before opening it again and forcing myself to actually process the account details properly, the way I would for any file requiring careful judgment. I hadn't initiated any collection outreach on their accounts, since general portfolio processing typically took several more weeks before individual outreach began, meaning Harold and Paulette had unknowingly been living inside a brief window where their defaulted debt existed, but hadn't yet started generating collection calls, a window that was about to close soon, regardless of anything I did or didn't do, a fact I understood with a kind of clarity that felt almost surreal, knowing something so consequential about 2 people who'd spent years assuming they knew exactly where I stood beneath them. I called Eric that evening and told him everything: the invoice, the audit, the $47,000. He was quiet for a long moment before saying, "That explains the country club, the simplified holidays, all of it." He asked how his parents had managed to hide something that size for so long. I told him it wasn't as unusual as people assume. Pride is often stronger than the fear of collections calls right up until it isn't, and that in my line of work, I'd seen far wealthier-seeming families hiding far worse. He was quiet again, processing, before asking whether I thought they'd known the debt had already been sold when they sent the invoice. "I don't think so," I said. "I think this invoice came from real, if misplaced, resentment completely separate from the debt, which somehow makes it stranger, not less insulting." I told him I hadn't decided yet what to do with the information, only that I needed to think carefully before deciding anything, the same way I'd think through any account requiring careful judgment rather than a reflexive response. Eric and I went to his parents' house the following weekend, invoice in hand, Paulette's expectant expression, suggesting she assumed we'd come to discuss payment terms. She'd set out coffee and a small plate of cookies, the same hospitable ritual she performed for every visit, as if the invoice sitting between us was simply another item of family business, rather than the calculated insult it actually was. Harold sat slightly apart from her, quieter than usual, glancing at the folder I'd brought with an expression I couldn't quite place at the time, though I'd understand it fully within the next few minutes. "We got your invoice," I said, setting it on the coffee table between us. "I want to talk about it honestly, but first I need to ask you something. Do you know a company called Meridian Receivables?" Paulette blinked, clearly thrown by the specificity of the question. "I don't believe so." "Why would we?" "Because it's the company that purchased $47,000 of your defaulted debt 4 months ago," I said. 2 credit accounts and a medical bill from Harold's hospitalization. "I work there. I run the audit team. I found your names in a portfolio 2 weeks ago by accident doing routine work I do every single week without ever expecting to recognize a single name on the list." Harold's face went white. "That's not possible. We've been handling that privately on our own for years now." "You stopped handling it 18 months ago," I said gently. "That's when the accounts went to collections. 4 months ago, my company bought the debt in bulk along with thousands of other unrelated accounts. I haven't started any collection outreach on your accounts yet because that process takes time, and because once I found your names, I needed to decide what I actually wanted to do about it before I did anything at all." "How could you possibly have kept this from us for 2 weeks?" Paulette said, voice tight, and said nothing. Said, "The same way you kept $47,000 of debt from your own son for 3 years," I said. "I needed time to decide how to handle it responsibly. I'd assumed you needed the same kind of time once, and I extended you the same patience I'd want extended to me." Paulette's hands went still around the invoice she'd sent us, now sitting on the table beside a printout I'd brought of their account summary. For a long moment, something genuinely cracked in her face. Real fear, unmistakable, the look of someone realizing the daughter-in-law she'd spent years treating as beneath the family's financial standing had been holding, without acting on it, the exact leverage that could have devastated them. Harold's hand found the arm of his chair, gripping it, knuckles whitening. "This is private," Paulette said, voice rising, composure fracturing. "You had no right to look into our finances. This is exactly the kind of overreach I always worried about with someone in your line of work." "I didn't look into your finances," I said. "My company bought your debt through a normal bulk acquisition the same way it buys thousands of other accounts every year, completely blind to individual names until the audit stage. I found your names doing my job, the same job you've spent 11 years implying wasn't respectable enough for this family." "So what happens now?" Harold asked quietly, "with the debt?" "Nothing has to happen," I said. "I can request the accounts be excluded from active collection given the conflict of interest, and they'll sit until they're eventually resold or written off, which is standard practice whenever a personal connection surfaces in a portfolio. Or you can work out a settlement directly, which my company would have offered regardless of who you are, at the same terms any account holder gets. I'm not here to collect from you. I'm here because you sent me a bill for 11 years of babysitting while sitting on $47,000 of debt you never once mentioned to your own son." "We were protecting Eric," Paulette said. "You don't understand what it's like watching your own finances slip after a lifetime of managing them well. There's a shame in it that's hard to explain to someone who's never had to feel it." "I understand it better than almost anyone you know," I said. "It's literally my job. I talk to people carrying exactly that shame every single week. That's exactly why the invoice you sent me is so hard to sit with. You were willing to bill me for imagined debts while hiding a very real one 3 times the size from the one person who could have actually helped, and possibly the one person in this family with the professional means to help responsibly." Harold spoke up then quietly. "We didn't want to be a burden," he said quietly, eyes on the table rather than either of us. "You weren't going to be a burden by telling us," I said. "You became one by hiding it and then sending me a bill for babysitting instead, as if the 11 years I'd already given this family counted for less than whatever pride kept you both quiet. Then, almost immediately, I watched Paulette reach for control again. "This doesn't erase what we've given this family over the years," she said. "That invoice still stands regardless of anything happening with the bank," Paulette Eric said, speaking for the first time since we'd arrived, voice quiet but unmistakably firm. "You sent my wife a bill for loving me while you were hiding a debt bigger than our mortgage. I think the invoice can wait." Paulette didn't have an answer for that. She sat there, her own itemized list of grievances on the table beside the account summary, listing everything they actually owed, and for the first time in 11 years, she looked at me like someone she'd have to reckon with honestly instead of quietly condescend to. I didn't pursue their debt, and I didn't need to. I filed the appropriate conflict of interest paperwork at work the following Monday, had their accounts formally excluded from any outreach my team conducted, and let the rest work itself out through normal channels untouched by me either way. Harold and Paulette never brought up the invoice again. Neither did I, though I kept the original in a drawer, the same instinct that had once made me file away small, odd financial details over the years, except this one I kept on purpose as a reminder of exactly how close condescension had come to costing them something real. Harold called me directly about 3 weeks later alone without Paulette on the line to ask quietly whether the debt would eventually go to an outside collector if my company resold the portfolio. I told him honestly that it might eventually, and that his best option was reaching out to Meridian's Standard Settlement Department directly on his own, as any account holder would, explaining the process the same way I'd explain it to any client without special treatment either way. He thanked me, said he appreciated me being straight with him instead of either helping too much or punishing him for asking. And we talked for a few minutes about something unrelated. The first genuinely easy conversation we'd had in years, both of us seemingly relieved to talk about anything else for a while. Paulette has been quieter around me since, not warmer exactly, but noticeably more careful, the sharp edges of her old comments sanded down into something closer to caution, replaced by a kind of watchfulness I'd never seen from her before. Harold oddly has been kinder, calling occasionally just to check in a way he never used to sometimes, about nothing more than the weather or a game he'd watched. I don't know if that's guilt or genuine reflection, and I've stopped needing to know which one it is. Eric and I still see his parents regularly holidays, mostly the way families do, though something in the room has shifted permanently, an old hierarchy quietly dismantled without anyone ever formally announcing it. Nobody has mentioned the invoice at a single family dinner since, though I suspect all 4 of us think about it more than we let on the paper itself, long gone, but the memory of it sitting at the table with us, regardless an uninvited guest, nobody quite has the nerve to name out loud. What I've learned sitting with all of this is that the people quickest to demand repayment from others are sometimes the ones who understand debt the least about their own lives. Paulette wanted a return on 11 years of holiday gifts and babysitting hours. What she actually needed was someone willing not to collect on the much larger debt she never wanted anyone, especially her own son, to see. If you've ever been billed emotionally or literally by someone who owed far more than they let on, tell me in the comments what finally exposed the real math: a document, a discovery at work, a number that didn't add up until suddenly it did. If this story hit home, share it with someone who's ever been made to feel indebted by people hiding a bigger debt of their own, and subscribe because there's another story like this one waiting for you next week.